Hey, hello, everyone. Let me just briefly unmute everyone. So if you'd like, you can say hello. It's good to see you all. Thanks for joining us. And so I am Professor Allison. And if you can't hear me, raise your hand or something like that. Also, if you have a question, I think most of you probably know the features of Zoom probably better than I do. So wave your hand or hit the button at the bottom that says raise hand. And so good to see you all. And welcome. This next semester, we'll be exploring the American Revolution, which is one of the most fascinating events in the history of the world. So if you came in not knowing that, you do now, but there's more to it, and so don't take my word for it. And I've been teaching this for a while, and I'm really feel like I'm just starting to figure it out. So we will be exploring it as we go along. Let me just see. I'm going to attempt to show you a slides on it. Okay, good. That's not what I wanted to show you. Maybe it is. Okay, good.
Professor Allison, we can't hear you if you're trying to talk.
I was gonna say, am I frozen?
Okay, are we back? Good.
We saw your screen, but we couldn't hear you.
You couldn't hear me?
Yeah.
I think you were frozen for a second.
Yeah, okay, I don't know. I just got a thing saying that Zoom had crashed, so which it sometimes does. I know that I've been having trouble with my internet connection, so if that happens, we all know that it was someone else's fault, and I didn't hit the wrong button. So, good. So I was still talking, and you could still hear me?
I couldn't hear you.
You couldn't, okay. How about now?
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was doing a meeting, actually giving a talk a couple of weeks ago, and I couldn't figure out how to get onto Zoom. And then suddenly I was on it. And then I heard they taped this because they wanted to make sure their audience heard everything. And the beginning, all you have is a blank screen and me saying various expletives because I couldn't get onto Zoom. So anyway, I'm glad we avoided that. And so I'm going to try this again because I went to a great deal of trouble to prepare these slides, and now I will be disappointed if you don't get to see them. Can you see, what do you see now?
Slide.
Looks like a coronation of something.
Oh, very good. It is a coronation of something. And this is September 22nd of 1761. And this is the coronation of King George III, which is really a great moment in history. High expectations for his reign. He was only 22 years old when he became king. So some of you may be older than that. I know I am. So he was very young and had great expectations for his reign. Let me just see. I got something saying that someone's trying to enter, and now I have to shrink this so I can. Did I just exit? Are you still on? Okay. Okay. Maybe we'll just forego the slides and I will paint pictures with words of this great moment in history when George III becomes the king. You know, he was the grandson of George II and the great-grandson of George I, but he was the first of the three Georges for whom English was his first language. They had become monarchs. George I became king in the 17 teens. Long story we don't need to get into. because George the First, well, in the 1680s and 1690s, there was a political crisis in England. England had a century of civil war in the 1600s, and it ended a war really between Parliament and the Crown about who would govern England. And Parliament wins. And Parliament in 1688 kicks out a king and then hires a new king. They find a king who's actually married to the daughter of the king they ousted. So she is in line for the throne, and her husband comes along, and Parliament gives them a list of rules, which Parliament calls their Bill of Rights. And the king and queen have to agree to this in order to govern England. And one of the rules is the monarch cannot be a Roman Catholic. That was a big issue in this whole century of turmoil that England had had. And so Parliament wins. Parliament is going to govern, and the king or queen cannot be a Roman Catholic. Thus, when Queen Anne died, there were about 40 people in line for the throne who were Catholic and were closer to England than the one that they found, who was George, who was the Elector of Hanover, a principality in Germany. And so he was invited to come and be king of England, a task he took somewhat reluctantly. He was more committed actually to being the Elector of Hanover than to being the King of England, so much so he never actually learned English. And then his son did become the king, King George II. He did learn English, but he also brought over German culture, which is why in England we have the composer George Frederick Handel spent most of his productive years in his water music suite. You may know was written for barges along the Thames. And so you have this bringing in, and it's also why Handel's great oratorio, The Messiah, which you probably can't escape around the holidays, is in English. You may wonder why a German composer is writing things in English. I realize we're not getting to the revolution yet. I'm just giving you really interesting background. And the important thing here is George III is thoroughly English. He never leaves England. His grandfather and great-grandfather spent about half of their time in Germany. He never leaves anywhere but England, and he is committed to being a patriot king. This is an Enlightenment idea. His grandfather, great-grandfather, had pretty much left the governing of England to Parliament. And he, though, wants to take a role in shaping political life. And he's qualified for this. So he becomes king on September 22nd of 1761. And his, I'm going to try the slides again. It may be disastrous, continue to be disastrous. And his spouse, Queen Charlotte, becomes the queen consort. And Charlotte is also German. And she and her husband had never met until she actually arrived from Germany. And they got married that night. He had seen a portrait of her, and he thought that the portrait did her too much justice. He was really floored when he saw it. This is like married, married at first sight. Think about this. And however, he does marry her, and then they have a long, faithful relationship, which is also not typical among monarchy at any time. And she bears 15 children, 13 of whom survive into adulthood, and 2 of them do become monarchs of Great Britain. And so Queen Charlotte and King George III are crowned at Westminster on September 22nd of 1761. I've mentioned that date so many times, it's probably going to be on the exam. Now, this seemed to be a great moment for Britain, the empire. A decade ago, England had entered into a war with the French Empire, which went very badly at first for the British Empire. We'll get into this in a bit. And actually, for most of this century, Britain and France had been at war. And Britain also had been at war with Spain for much of this century. And the wars, two things that come out of this series of wars. Think about this. This is really the beginning of Britain as we know her today. During the previous war in the 1740s, 2 songs entered into the British songbook. One was Rule Britannia, written on news of the siege of Cartagena in South America. And it was actually a song written for a show, but then the audience responded so enthusiastically to this song that they demanded encore after encore. And Rule Britannia, which talks about Britannia ruling the waves and Britons never will be slaves. It's really an energizing song. And as I'm saying this, we're remembering that Britain would have included the North American colonies, which we'll be getting to in a minute, as well as the other colonies in the Americas. That is, Britannia ruling the waves, rules the waves because she has developed the biggest navy in the world and is going to use it quite effectively. Now, here in Westminster, watching the coronation, sitting up in the balcony, and this was a wonderful moment for him, is Benjamin Franklin, who had come to England in the 1750s as an emissary from the Pennsylvania Assembly. They had sent him because Pennsylvania was governed by the Penn family, and the Assembly was constantly fighting with the Penns. And they thought that the Penns were mismanaging things. They didn't pay taxes. That was one big issue. And they wanted the king, in this case it would have been George II, to take over the colony. Franklin comes, tries to get Pennsylvania turned into a royal colony. That doesn't happen, but Franklin so much enjoys life in London, he stays and stays and stays. And he becomes part of the English intellectual, I should say British intellectual scientific world. He becomes friendly with William Strahan, a publisher, who's a Scottish publisher but lives in London. He also becomes acquainted and actually a friend with David Hume, one of the foremost intellectuals of the age, a Scottish intellectual. Adam Smith, the economist, and others are part of Franklin's circle in London. And here you can see this portrait of him done in London. And gazing down on him is Sir Isaac Newton. So here is Franklin, Dr. Franklin, studying scientific literature. Franklin actually already was an international celebrity because of his experiments with electricity. And he had become the center of life of an intellectual world in London. And he is sitting way up in the balcony watching the coronation procession for King George III. But probably the thing that stirred him the most was seeing as part of this procession his son William. William Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's illegitimate son, who had been his closest confidant through most of their lives, now was part of the British court. He knew the young king. He knew others in the court. So think about this. Benjamin Franklin, whose father was a soap boiler in Boston, never went to college, ran away from home when he was a teenager, goes to Philadelphia and makes a living as a printer, has a son born out of wedlock who is now part of the British imperial world. In fact, William shortly will be appointed the governor of New Jersey. What a moment this is for all of them. William Franklin would have been about 30 years old at this time, almost 10 years older than the king, but clearly they had made it as part of this empire. Just 10 years earlier, so Benjamin Franklin had written an essay about population. And he looked at the fact that the American population was doubling every 20 years. And he speculated that in 100 years, there would be more Englishmen on this side of the Atlantic than on the other side of the Atlantic. And what an advantage that would be to the empire, he thought, having this new world as part of it. So there's great expectations, high hopes here in 1761. Also, that war that began in the 1750s was coming to an end. Let me tell you a little bit about the war that begins in 1754. One of the reasons there is a war in this period, the British and French Empire were always going to war with each other in this period, and pretty much from 1691 until 1783, the British and French empires were at war. And then they take a break after 1783, go back to war again in 1793, and the war goes on until 1815. So more than a century of warfare between these two empires, and lots of things change in the course of this war. Now, I had meant to show you a map of North America. Let me see if I can find it here. Yes. So we all should carry in our heads a map of of North America. And let me tell you what happened here. Um, the French Empire, I don't think I enabled my capacity to write on this, so I apologize. The French Empire in North America consisted mainly of the area along the St. Lawrence River, but then extended. And the British colonies were huddled along the coast. And we'll just back up for a minute and think about when these countries started making claims to North America. None of them was looking for North America. None of them was thinking, I want to settle what place that's going to become a continental power one day. They were all looking for routes to Asia. And that's what had started Spain and Portugal on their routes in the 1400s and 1500s. The British and the French are now catching up. And they're looking for a route to Asia. And also they're looking for gold. You know, the Spanish had wanted to find Asia. They didn't find Asia. Instead, they found a lot of gold and silver. And ultimately, they get to the Philippines. The French, the British, the Dutch, the Swedes, the others are competing with the Spanish in the New World, but also looking for routes to Asia. And every river they find, they think is going to lead them across this continent to the South Sea. And as we know, none of them does. The English do wind up along these rivers, which are along the coast of North America and about 40 miles inland, sometimes sooner. There's a chain of mountains that blocks access to the interior. The French, though, landed at the St. Lawrence. And the St. Lawrence, you can take inland into the middle of the continent. It's fed by these Great Lakes, which are inland seas. And then from the Great Lakes and from the lakes themselves, it's a relatively easy portage to rivers that would lead them to the Ohio and the Mississippi River. And this is going to allow the French not to get to the South Sea, but to get control of the North American continent. In fact, in the 1740s, the King of France sent someone to plant lead plates at various places along the Ohio River, announcing that this belongs to the King of France, usually at junctions of the rivers. And the French also were trading with the native people in the interior, saying, why don't you be our friends instead of the English friends? Why don't you trade with us instead of with the English? And the French were able to do this because the English had not settled North America as one English settlement. Instead, it was about a dozen English settlements along the coast of North America. And each of these had its own interests. I've mentioned Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had sent Benjamin Franklin because they wanted Pennsylvania to become a royal colony. Now, New York initially had been settled by the Dutch, and New York had access to, New York really functioned, the most important place in New York in the 1700s would have been Albany. Albany was close to the Iroquois Confederation, and the Iroquois were the most powerful native group in North America. 6 nations of the Iroquois who all agreed with, who got along with each other and then attacked their enemies. And for most of the 1600s, they had been at war with the Hurons, the Algonquian people to the north. They also went to war with the New Englanders. And New York became English in about 1660. It had been Dutch. The English take it over, keep the fur trade going, and then want to keep it going and make an alliance with the Iroquois. New York and the Iroquois say, okay, the Iroquois are in charge of all the native people in North America. So because the Iroquois are our allies, all the native people are subservient to us because they're also subservient to the Iroquois. And all native people should trade only with the fur traders from New York. Now, this, of course, irritated the Delaware, the people to the south of the Iroquois, and they made an alliance with Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania supports the Delaware against the Iroquois, and Pennsylvania says, well, wait a minute, we want to have people go trade along the Ohio River. New York can't claim all the trade along the Ohio River for them. And then Virginia, actually the first of the North American colonies to be planted along the Chesapeake. Virginians had depleted most of the soil because tobacco wears out the soil pretty quickly. This would be the moment when the Suffolk would ask me to also warn you about using tobacco generally, but I'm an agnostic on the subject. Smoke if you want. And one day I'll give you my lecture on how smoking made America great, which my mother, who was an avid smoker for 75 years, would be looking down or looking up and smiling, knowing that we're I'm not encouraging you to smoke, just because this is being recorded. We'll talk about it offline. Anyway, getting back to this, Virginia had depleted the tobacco soil. They're looking at the fertile land along the Ohio River, and they want to sell it. In fact, the Virginians form an Ohio company to sell land along the Ohio River. Now, of course, there's a big problem with that, because the native people along the Ohio River are still using the land, and also New York says, hey, those people are subservient to us. Virginia can't sell the land. Pennsylvania says those people are our allies. Virginia can't sell the land. These three colonies are disagreeing with each other about what should happen along the Ohio River. And consequently, the French are coming in and saying, why are you listening to those mopes? Why don't you just do business with us? We're not going to try to take your land. So the native people along the Ohio are doing this, and this really alarms the British government. It also really alarms this man whose picture you see, the man on your left. I think that's Sir William Johnson. And Sir William Johnson was Irish. His uncle had owned land along the Mohawk River in what's now upstate New York, had sent young William Johnson off to manage the estate, and William Johnson did. And he managed it so well that the Mohawk adopted him. He became an adopted Mohawk, and he became a close ally of the other man you see, whose name is Dayandogowan, or Hendricks. And Hendricks was a Mohawk sachem, a Mohawk leader. And what happens in 1754, alarmed that the French are moving into the Ohio River Valley, the British government tells these American colonies, what you have to do is go out to Albany and make sure that the Mohawk and you are allies. You're allied with the Iroquois. Shore up your relationship with the Iroquois. So in the summer of 1754, the delegates from different North American colonies assemble in Albany. And among the delegates are Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, Thomas Hutchinson from Massachusetts, and various people from other colonies. And one thing that comes out of this is Hutchinson and Franklin devise a plan for a union of the colonies. How about if instead of having 13, however many of these little colonies that are fighting among themselves, we all get together and have a council that will represent each of the colonies, a governor general who will be appointed by the crown, and that way we can devise ways for our own defense, and the British government won't have to tax us to defend us because we'll be doing it ourselves. And the governor general will make sure we don't do anything that's against the empire, and this will really be a way of incorporating these 13 colonies more closely into the empire and keep them from fighting among themselves, which is all they ever seem to do. And Franklin had this woodcut drawn of a snake cut into pieces. And the caption was, join or die. That is, if these colonies keep fighting among themselves, what's going to happen is the French are simply going to come in, and we'll look at the map again in a minute, but imagine if the French controlled the interior of the continent, and these British colonies are along the coast. Pretty soon, the French would be able to kick them off of the coast unless they got together and united, did something for their own defense. And they send this proposal to the different colonial assemblies. We don't need to go into great detail about this plan of union. Every year, this council would meet in a different one of the capitals of the colonies. But none of the colonies want to do this. I mean, why would Virginia want to get into an alliance with New York and Pennsylvania, since they had different ideas about what should happen in the Ohio River Valley? Why would New England want to be part of this? Because New England had its own interests. I should say, Massachusetts was really interested in this because whenever there was a war between the British Empire and the French Empire, Massachusetts was on the front line because New England, as you probably know, adjoins New France. So if New France is going to send its native allies to attack, they're going to be attacking in Massachusetts as well as New Hampshire. And at this time, of course, Massachusetts included the province of Maine. So you have the colonies saying, we don't want to have anything to do with this because it's going to take away from our interest here. So Franklin says in the aftermath of this that these colonies will only unite if the British government forces them to. And he was kind of hoping the British government would. Now, the way they're going to force them to isn't exactly what Franklin was expecting. And let's see, what is our, yeah, so here we have our map showing the North American colonies because a war does begin that same summer. These guys are meeting in Albany. They don't, by the way, shore up the relationship with the Iroquois. What happens at the meeting is Virginia takes the opportunity to buy land in Kentucky from the Iroquois. The Iroquois actually own Kentucky. The Shawnee are in Kentucky, but Virginia, using the logic that the Iroquois control everything, we get the Shawnee, the Iroquois say, sure, we'll sell you Kentucky, and it doesn't matter to us. And other colonies do similar things to cut their own deals with the native people. And while this is happening, the French had built a fort, actually, where the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers joined to form the Ohio River, an area sometimes called Three Rivers. And they built Fort Duquesne there. And they're making deals with the Indians in that area. This area today is within the territorial confines of the state of Pennsylvania. At this time, it was part of a territory claimed by Virginia. It also, because these native people were supposed to be allied with the Iroquois, was under New York, thought its jurisdiction. So you have these three different entities all claiming that they have something to do here. And meanwhile, the French have come in and built a fort. And it's not because those French are sneaky people always doing things like this. It's because the French are smart. They see what they can do here. These English colonies are going to kill each other off. We'll build a fort here. And the Virginians, though, are the first to act. They send a militia unit led by Colonel George Washington out to inspect. And Washington mistakes a French ambassador for a French officer and kills him. And then he is taken captive by the French. There are a lot more French than there are Virginians in the area. And they, well, what happens here? Washington taking him captive by the French, and they make him sign a confession, which is in French. And Washington doesn't happen to read French, so that's a great disadvantage, along with encouraging you to smoke or not to smoke. I should encourage you to learn another language if you're ever going to find yourself in a situation like this. And the document Washington signed says, I assassinated the French envoy. And this, he goes back to Virginia anyway, and then the British say, oh, the French have built a fort there, we better do something. And so they send an army out to get the French out of the Ohio River. And things go very badly for the English for a number of years in this war. And by the way, every time there is a war between the English and the French, both countries' real interest was not what's happening in North America, but what's happening in Europe. And they would be more interested in getting land in Europe or protecting holdings in Europe than in doing anything in North America. Voltaire, the great French man of letters, said that why are we fighting over a few acres of ice, which is how, believe it or not, someone in France would have imagined Canada back in the 1760s. Anyway, you have this war that begins, huge war, and it's a global war. It's really the first global war because it is fought in North America and in Europe, but also in Asia. The French and English fight in India and in Africa, in the Mediterranean. In fact, shortly after this debacle in North America, an English admiral sent to relieve Minorca fails to do that. He's not given enough support to raise a siege in Minorca, and he gets back to England, and because England knows the war is going really badly, we need to do something to show we're serious. And so what they do, of course, is shoot poor Admiral Byng because they say they try him as a coward and shoot him, an unfair thing, but this is what happens in war. Lots of unfair things are going to happen. And after this, England has a system, I mentioned kind of briefly, the system with a parliament and a king. Parliament really runs things. And when Parliament mismanages things in England, what's going to happen is they're going to get a new head of Parliament. The guy who runs things in England is the Prime Minister, and he is responsible for running the government. And so they get a new Prime Minister, actually a series of new Prime Ministers, And the problem was they couldn't get one that was A, capable, and B, got along with the king. And finally, the king does. He didn't want William Pitt to become the prime minister. See, I think I shouldn't have mentioned Rule Britannia at the beginning, because now this is becoming all British history, and we'll all be joining together singing Rule Britannia at any moment. But Pitt becomes the prime minister, and Pitt realizes that the place we can win the war isn't in Europe, but in North America. And so Pitt focuses on North America, and not only on holding on to British possessions in North America, but on taking the French possessions. So in a stunning series of moves in 1759, 1760, the British conquer New France. They seize Montreal and then Quebec. I'm sorry, Quebec first, then Montreal. And this is a wonderful painting by Benjamin West of the death of General Wolfe at Quebec. And Wolfe, of course, this probably isn't exactly how it looked. West, by the way, was another American. He was a Pennsylvanian. He had gone to England to become an artist, and he becomes one of the most successful artists of the era. In fact, he becomes the portrait painter for King George III. Here he's a Pennsylvanian. He's actually the head of the Academy of Arts in London. And this is his death of General Wolfe. Great moment as Wolfe captures the citadel of Quebec, defeats General Montcalm, dies in the process. He and Montcalm both die in this battle, which gives Britain control of all of New France. And then after this, the English do send an expedition to take Havana, which they do. You know, not just will get the French out of North America, they're beginning to get the Spanish out of the Americas too. The British capture Florida. And so you have everything up to the Mississippi River is now in British hands. This is the triumph that you could not have anticipated. And it's happening just before the death of King George II and the coronation of George III. So you can imagine why. This is such a moment to think about the future that the British have. I'm sorry, I'm getting choked up about this, and I may have to excuse myself to go and, well, no, keep a stiff upper lip. And so in the wake of this, great victory for the English, for the British, I should say. England, as you know, is one kingdom that is on the same island as Wales and Scotland. And I apologize to those of you who are Welsh or Scottish if I keep referring to England when I mean Britain. But with this victory, of course, there are some big issues. And one, of course, is, so what happens now with the Ohio River Valley? And one thing that happens is the British commander in the area says, okay, we had been giving the native people gifts to keep them on our side, but we no longer have to worry about them being on our side because they don't have another side to go on. And so they stopped giving gifts to the native people and the other things. So the native people actually in 1763 attack these lightly fortified places throughout this region. Most of the forts you see here had been French forts. You can see they have French names. Fort Presque which is Fort Niagara, Sandusky is a river, the Miami were the native people, St. Joseph, Wotinen, and in a coordinated attack, there are dozens of different Native American groups in this area, in the Northwest Territory, and Pontiac, who was a war leader, I can't remember at the moment if he wasn't in Miami, he was in Ottawa, and he coordinates this attack, which takes every British fort west of what had been Fort Duquesne. Does anyone know, by the way, what Fort Duquesne became?
A college?
No, it doesn't become a college. There is a college called Duquesne,
Oh,
but
okay.
good guess though.
Okay,
No,
just a guess.
it's a fort. It had been named for a French guy. Now it's you can unmute yourself and shout out an answer if you'd like. It's where the Monongahela and the Allegheny rivers join to form the Ohio River, hence called Three Rivers or Tri-Rivoire.
Trois-Rivières.
Excuse me?
You said Three Rivers?
Three Rivers.
Trois-Rivières?
Yeah. But now it has an English name. Remember,
Oh.
English people, and I am descended from English and Scottish people, often have trouble pronouncing names in other languages. So if it's called Duquesne, we don't like it because it's French, and plus we'll want to pronounce the ESQ. And who was the prime minister who led Britain through this war? Yes, James.
Pitt, right?
William Pitt, yes.
William Pitt.
So what does Fort Duquesne become?
Oh, Pittsburgh?
Yes, yeah.
That's a good one.
Fort Pitt, yes, okay.
Oh,
Okay. And so now Pontiac and his allies have gotten all of the forts west of Fort Pitt, and they very nearly get Fort Pitt. And so this, well, the British don't want to have to maintain a heavy presence out here to keep the Indians from attacking their forts. And they know that what's going to happen in the wake of this is a lot of people are going to want to, one of the reasons for this war is these people along the coast have been wanting to move out there, or the Virginians wanted to sell the land. So what's a good way to prevent this from happening? Once you've put down the Indian uprising, Pontiac's War, which came as a complete surprise to the British, you need to do something to maintain peace here that isn't going to be catastrophically expensive the way this war has been. So one thing that the British government does in 1763 is the king issues a proclamation saying that there can't be any white settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, closing off that area. It's going to be an Indian territory, and we'll figure out later what to do with all of it. But right now, you people on the coast who are clamoring to get cheap land out there, knock it off. You're going to have to stay where you are because you can't move west. Of course, this is going to be seen in a different way by these people on the coast. I mean, they'd gone to war for the purpose of getting this land, and now we can't get it. So what's up with that? And so you have that as one of the issues here. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is outline some things that are going to happen over the next decade or so. And virtually everything the British Empire tries to do is going to be interpreted in a different way by the folks in North America. And one is this proclamation of 1763. I don't know what I just did. Let me see. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the proclamation says no one moves west. Now, the war left the British Empire very heavily in debt. I should tell you that if you do have an opportunity to be hanging out on Tremont Street and you hear any of the tour guides go by or a duck boat go by, you are going to hear that the British were heavily in debt as a result of this big war, and they tried to tax the Americans to pay for the war debt. And that's completely not true. Okay, so yes, the British were heavily in debt. Yes, they did tax the Americans, but the tax on the Americans would not come close to paying the British war debt. Let me just see if I can illustrate this a bit. The British war debt in 1763 was 122 million pounds. Okay, that today would be about 8 billion pounds. I know I throw out a figure like 122 million pounds. You may think, boy, that doesn't sound like so much. Billions, yes, that starts to get our attention. The annual interest payment, this is, the British had borrowed this money to fight the war. It's one of the things William Pitt did. There are essentially three ways of paying for a war. I guess there are four ways if you conquer another country and take all of their stuff. But here, you can raise taxes, usually unpopular, but you do pay as you go. Two, you can print more money. Of course, the money then becomes worthless. Three, you can borrow it. Also, taxes tend to be politically unpopular, okay? So taxes, print money, or borrow money, which the British do. And they borrowed money to the tune of 122 million pounds. The annual interest payment was 4.5 million pounds. The peacetime budget for the entire empire was only 8 million pounds. So half of the peacetime budget is spent on this debt. You know, I hate to belabor the point about debt, but you'll be spending the rest of your lives thinking about debt because we're incurring it right now. And so this is, of course, a big problem for Great Britain. Now, secondly, one of the things the war had brought to light is that the American colonies actually were expanding. And in fact, Franklin had pointed this out in 1750. Their population doubled every 20 years. And it doubled, you know, one of the reasons a population grows is because people are doing well, they have children. And so that's a good thing. And by the way, one of the theories about colonies that the Spanish, the French, the Dutch all really believed was that if people leave the mother country and go off to a colony, that weakens the mother country. In fact, the population will decline at home, and that will be a bad thing. And it's why these countries very carefully monitored who would leave to go to North America. And Franklin, in his essay on population, notes that not only has the American population doubled every 20 years, so has the English population. The population of Great Britain has been increasing, even as people are leaving to go to North America. So this is an interesting phenomenon. And, you know, the population of the American colonies was increasing exponentially. You know, between 1760 and 1770, the population, the 1770s, the population goes from about 1.5 million to over 2 million. And that's a 33% increase. In some places are double. Georgia's population doubles. Georgia had only been launched as a colony in the 1720s. And Kentucky, there hadn't been any white people out in Kentucky before this war, but by the end of the 1770s, there were 15,000. And there are, between 1760 and 1776, something like 260 new towns are created in New England. Where New England, this place that has been settled for about 150 years, has terrible climate, lousy soil, but you have all of these new towns being started along the Connecticut River and in Maine. This tremendous expansion. In 1750, the population of the province of New York was about 73,000. In 1771, it was about 170,000. So you have this exponential population increase going on in the American colonies. And the American colonies are doing pretty well with trade. You know, and in fact, this map I'm showing you is, what do you notice about this map, by the way? I should not do all the talking.
I would say this map is before they became independent, because it's
Yes.
only 13 colonies, and has to be before 1803 because of the Louisiana Purchase.
Yes, that's true. That's good. Yeah, it is well before. It is, I think, in the 1760s. But you're right, and it shows these different colonies. I mean, they're colored differently. You can see they all do extend to the Mississippi River. Anything else stand out about the map?
One
Yes.
thing I'm curious about is it seems like there's actually a great degree of detail on kind of western portions out here.
Yeah, that's
Had that
true.
been
There is.
explored enough?
It
or-
has, somewhat it had. Remember, the French had been along the Mississippi River for quite a while, which is why they're planting plates along the Ohio. St. Louis formed in the early first decade or so of the century. New Orleans also in about 1712. And also the main reason the French are invested in this area isn't because of, you know, wanting French people to go there, although there were French people there. but to trade with the native people. So knowing who the native people were is very important to them. And so mapping to the geography, how you get around, which is how the native people would get around. I mean, during this war that I just mentioned, there are a couple of battles along Lake Champlain. Most of the people fighting come from Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. That is, they go by canoe between these areas. It's, so native people have been traversing this area for quite a while, and someone had done this really intricate work of cartography. There are lots of areas they don't know much about, but the Mississippi River is the barrier, but still west of that, there is a knowledge of what's going on out there. Anything else? This is interesting as we look at this and just.
Professor, I wanted to know, how come the Caribbean and Central America are a lot more detailed and the maps are a lot more complete than the US? And you could sort of see on the top left corner, also Canada seems to be more explored on the Western front than the US is. Or is it just the map?
That's very good observations. Canada, yes, the British and the French had been vying for Canada. I mean, the British had been looking for a Northwest Passage. And so they, Hudson Bay, they had been exploring. And the French, of course, were there. The Caribbean is big because if we were sitting around in London in this period thinking about the American colonies, our focus really would not be on Virginia or New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. It would be on Barbados and Jamaica, which were the colonies that generated the most revenue for the British Crown. And these colonies, where sugar is being produced in the 1640s and 50s, they had changed from producing tobacco to producing sugar. And where Spain had claimed these islands, but the British, the French, the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes all tried to claim places that the Spanish couldn't patrol. So the Spanish had the large islands, Cuba and the Dominican Republic. France claimed the western part of the island of Saint-Domingue. And Saint-Domingue was the most important French possession. And Barbados and Jamaica, the British take Jamaica in the 1660s, and they also are producing sugar there. Barbados, very far to the east, it sticks out from the islands to the east. The Spanish couldn't patrol everywhere. So, and the Dutch actually set up trading bases on various islands in the Caribbean. The Dutch aren't so much going to be interested in harvesting sugar here as they are in trading with everybody else. And also in the East Indies, and South America and South Africa. So you have, these islands are really important because they're producing sugar. And sugar is the most important commodity of the 18th century. And sugar is what's making the British Empire great. Sugar being produced in Barbados, Jamaica, and now after the British get half of Cuba, and they'll hold on to Cuba for about 12 years, producing it there. And the North American colonies are important because of their relationship to the West Indian trade. There is a codfish hanging in the Massachusetts State House, and it's hanging there because codfish produced, harvested here off the coast and then packed in barrels that are grown with the lumber from this area and then put on ships built with the lumber from the area, taken down to the West Indies and sold, exchanged for sugar, which is then brought back here and turned into rum. And the codfish, cheap source of protein, the planters in the West Indies want to buy food because it's cheaper to do that than it is to have their enslaved population diverting land that could be used to produce a cash crop to something as insignificant as food. And the South Carolina had been formed in the 1670s, 1680s by investors from Barbados. They ran out of land in Barbados. They wanted another place to build a plantation, and actually a colony. And the real thing they're doing in South Carolina before they discover that they can harvest rice there, and that's another long story, is they are getting lumber the naval stores, you need also beef to feed the labor force in the West Indies. So South Carolina, and they're also trading with the Indians there. So formed from Barbados. You had these North American colonies. As I said, New England operates as to build ships and ship things around, also to harvest codfish. Pennsylvania is producing wheat and flour, again, going into this market here, or all trying to go into the West Indies, because this is really where you're going to go if you want to get rich. And you're getting rich through slave labor. And most of the owners of the English plantations in the West Indies live in London, or they're investors who have these holdings here. And different from the North American colonies, which tend to be owner occupied. So the West Indies and Central America are more detailed because they loomed much larger in the British mind than did these places in North America. And so, I mean, we are trying to look at the world the way it would have seemed in the 1750s and 1760s. If we were in London and thinking about the Americas, Barbados, Jamaica would be much more important than Massachusetts or Pennsylvania. The thing that the North American colonies have a lot of is land. And so that's going to be what's going to draw people from the old world to the new. Okay, so sugar, as I said, is this great commodity. And during this war I had been talking about, one thing the British government realizes it can do is tax this trade on sugar, actually regulate it. So in having spent the first hour or so belaboring the point about September 22nd of 1761, I should caution you, I'm usually not very good with dates. If it's an important date, I'll remember it. And I think it was 1764, or it could have been it must have been 1762, perhaps. The British government passed the Sugar Act. And this is an act to regulate the trade in sugar. And it's putting a tax on sugar imported into North American ports. There already was a tax on sugar imported into North American ports, a tax of, I think, 9 pence a gallon. So every gallon of molasses you bring in, you pay 9 pence. The Sugar Act cuts that by 2/3. So you're going to pay a 3 pence per gallon tax. However, in order to collect a tax, today, well, it used to be your taxes were taken out of your paycheck. Most of us cheerfully send in our taxes, or we go to the store and we pay the taxes. We don't question it. In this case, you're putting this tax on sugar. You need someone to collect it. And it had been really a tough sell getting anyone to go to the colonies to collect taxes. And so Parliament had put this really high tax on sugar, but realized sending someone over to each of these ports where sugar might be imported to collect it won't be cost effective. So we won't actually bother collecting it. So yeah, there's a high tax on sugar, but no one ever collects it. And people don't voluntarily send a remittance to England saying, hey, I imported a lot of molasses this year. Here's what I owe you. So for almost a century, there had been a tax on sugar, never collected. Now, the British Parliament says we're going to start collecting the tax, which means we are going to have to send people over to make sure it's collected. And then B, we're going to lower the tax because that would really hit people too hard. So in 1762, the British government says, okay, taxes on sugar, everyone has to pay them. We're sending over tax collectors. And this is really when the fun begins here in North America, because people didn't like paying this tax. And they said, well, wait a minute. We've only been taxed by our own assemblies. This is actually an argument made in this pamphlet that a Boston lawyer named James Otis wrote. The rights of the British colonies asserted and proved. Let me just give you a little more background on Otis. He was one of the highest powered lawyers in Boston. He had been the Solicitor General for the province. That's the equivalent of being the Attorney General. And in 1760, during this whole war, there are these laws about, things that are being imported, you have to pay taxes on. And the local customs inspector, a fellow named Lechmere, knew that someone was bringing in a cargo load of goods and then offloading them. But this guy wouldn't let the customs inspector aboard. And this is a problem you have if you are a customs inspector, just getting aboard the vessel. So under British law, you can go to court and get a writ of assistance. This is a writ, and you're the customs collector. Go to a judge, say, hey, I want to go look in, I'll just pick, Sean Finn's warehouse to see what he's got. He's not going to let me in. So the writ of assistance says, I now can get Jacob and James and Jesse to go along with me to inspect this. Sean might close the door on one person, but when the customs collector shows up with essentially a posse, he's probably going to change his tune. And so the inspector is a guy named Leachmere, goes to Mr. Otis and says, can you get me a writ of assistance so I can go inspect Sean's warehouse? And Otis says, absolutely not. I think a writ of assistance is a violation of Sean's rights as an Englishman to be secure in his person against an unreasonable search and seizure. And the writ simply says, hey, you can go look in the warehouse. Not only you, but anyone you deputize can go look around. How do you feel about that, Sean? You want someone looking around your warehouse?
Not particularly.
Yeah, so yeah, but the writ of assistance, imagine that you and, well, let's say you and Jacob had a long-running feud, and now he's one of the guys deputized. He can go look in because he has a writ of assistance. That's probably, Jacob, I know you'll have good reason for wanting to go and look in because this guy's hoarding all this stuff, not paying taxes. But Otis says it's a violation of Sean's rights to be free against an unreasonable search. And not only that, Otis resigns as the Solicitor General so he can go to court when Mr. Leachmere goes to court and argue as to why a writ of assistance violates the British Constitution. And he appears before an Admiralty Court. And the Admiralty Court consists of 5 judges from the Superior Court who have been created as an Admiralty Court. And they have Mr. Leachmere saying, I want a writ of assistance. And then Otis gives a 5-hour lecture on why writs of assistance violate the British Constitution. And not only that, he says, putting this power in the hands of anyone is going to it's going to make us into slaves. And then he makes an argument against slavery. It's really an astonishing thing. Now, I should say, we only know what Otis said because many years later, John Adams wrote this down. And Adams said, he went to this hearing in the old State House in Boston. And the hearing was held in the council chamber. The courtroom was on the other side of the building. And these judges are seated between a portrait on the left of King Charles I and a portrait on the right of King James II. And Otis said it was an abuse of power like this that cost one king his head and another his throne. And it's an astonishing argument that Otis made against the writs of assistance. Now, some of the more cynical among you may be saying, I bet as Solicitor General, he probably had a fairly modest salary, but if the Boston merchants who are getting rich by importing sugar don't want a writ of assistance, they could have hired him. But Otis says he would not accept a fee in this case. He would despise a fee. He is arguing that this is a pro bono case that Otis is making. Unfortunately, he doesn't win, but as John Adams says, then and there, the child independence was born. As Otis is making the case against writs of assistance, and then 2 years later, the British are sending over customs inspectors and to create a sugar tax, and Otis is writing about the rights of the British colonies asserted and proved, showing how this sugar tax is going to upset the rights of the people of the British colonies. Really, because they don't want to pay taxes. This is the Boston Almanac showing James Otis on the front of it. And so you have here in British North America, Otis and others making this argument against the tax. And the reason we don't want this tax is because it's been made without our consent. It's made by Parliament. We are not represented in Parliament. Now, if you are British, you think that's a nonsensical argument because Parliament actually doesn't represent anyone. Parliament represents the kingdom. You know, the actually, it's supposed to represent the merchants, the commoners, the House of Commons. The House of Lords represents the aristocracy. And you don't go to Parliament in order to represent the constituency that sent you, because a lot of constituencies don't have any people in them. And if you happen to be a friend of the prime minister and you lose your seat, he'll find another of these, the rotten boroughs, as they're called. You know, Parliament had been created back between 1100 and 1300, and some of the places that did have a member of Parliament, no, it's a member and not a representative, did have people in them then, but didn't now. And then there were other places that hadn't existed in 1300 and now do. Places like Manchester, Birmingham, most of London don't have a member of Parliament, because the member of Parliament isn't supposed to look out for his handful of constituents. You know, every 7 years there's an election for Parliament, unless they need one more often. And you don't even have to have ever been to the place that has sent you if you are a member. And this is much different from the way the American system works. In the American colonies, there is an assembly, and in Massachusetts in particular, that assembly does represent the people of the towns. Each town has at least one representative in the assembly. And there's elected for a 1-year term, except in Rhode Island where it's every 6 months. And you were there to represent what the people, the voters in Framingham wanted, or Roxbury, or Boston, or Dorchester, any of these other towns. You know, members of Parliament never have been, they're supposed to think about the good of the empire as a whole. And so according to the British theory, everyone is represented by virtue of the fact that members of Parliament are thinking about the good of the whole empire. And there are lots of different interests in the empire they're trying to, think about. Whereas in America, you're supposed to think about the people who elected you. And so it's actual representation in America, virtual representation in Britain, two very different ways of looking at it. So when Americans said, wait a minute, we've been taxed without our consent, well, what does that mean? Because people in England are taxed without their consent. And in fact, they pay a lot more taxes than people in America do because, of course, if you've been sent by your town to be their representative and you start raising their taxes, they're going to find someone else to go in your place. Try running for office thinking that your constituents really are not as important as the good of the province as a whole, and see how long you last. So this is the state of things here in the early 1760s. You have in America, this is the Virginia Assembly, and here you have the Parliament. Very different ways of looking at things. And I think this probably is a good time for me to take a break and just briefly tell you what it is you'll be doing this semester. I mean, as you can probably see, once I get started, I have trouble stopping. Let me just see if I can stop the share. Good, okay. I apologize for getting lost in my narrative. Any questions about anything?
Actually, just a quick question on the customs collectors.
Yes.
So I know you said that originally they didn't collect the tax because it wasn't really cost effective for them to send out customs collectors.
Yeah.
Had that situation changed at some point with the new stamp act, the new
The Sugar Act? Not really. The customs revenue that's it actually is only going to generate about £78,000 a year. Okay, so it's not a huge amount, but it is enough to send customs collectors. And the thinking is, if we can regulate this trade, that will benefit the empire as a whole. And think about it. If write this down so the next time you hear a tour guide saying they raised taxes because to pay for the war, the interest payment was £4.5 million a year. These customs duties are raising £78,000 a year. You can do the math. And so it's going to take a real long. You're not even paying the interest with that. But the idea is, these colonies, instead of being kind of these independent places, each doing its own thing, will be tied to British trade. And So it's really a way of regulating trade as opposed to trying to raise a huge revenue. I don't know if this answers your question, but just one follow-up is in the later 1760s, as the British government continues trying to impose taxes, a guy in Pennsylvania, John Dickinson, writes a pamphlet where he says the British Parliament does have the power to regulate trade, but it does not have the power to tax us internally. And he tries to draw a distinction between, you could raise a tax, say, you could tax the sugar trade conceivably if it's an external tax, but not an internal tax. It's an argument that really consumes these folks, and thinking about internal versus external, ultimately in the long run, it would be a difficult proposition. One other little story about this is in 1764, a guy named Robinson is sent to be the customs collector in Newport. And he is getting an annual salary of, I don't know, maybe a couple £1,000 a year. And the various merchants in Newport call on him shortly after he arrives, says, how much are you getting every year? And he tells them, he said, well, we'll give you twice that if when our ships come in, you're looking the other way. And he, of course, is offended. They would think he could be bribed like that. And then, of course, he finds he can't get any of them to appear in court when he does try to get aboard one of their vessels. So, yeah, it's cost effective to send over a customs collector, but it's going to cost even more to send over all of the apparatus you're going to need to collect the taxes.
Oh.
I don't know if that answers your question or if it further confuses things.
I'd say so.
Other questions, thoughts? Okay, I did post the syllabus. Let me just see if I can find it also to refresh my memory about how we'll be proceeding this semester. I'm hoping that before the end of the semester, we'll be able to go visit some of the places in town that, so I've given you, not given you, I've asked you to read a lot of books. My short book about the revolution is really a concise overview of things. And then we have books about different topics. Bernard Balin is a series of essays on people involved in this. He was one of the foremost scholars of the revolution. Carol Birkin, another of the foremost scholars of the revolution, is a really good book about women in the revolutionary period. Colin Calloway, who is one of the foremost scholars on Native Americans, has a good book, very good book on the American Revolution in Indian country, trying to look at the effect it had on Native people. David Hackett Fisher, who is one of the great narrative historians of all time, his book Washington's Crossing is about the painting, but also about Washington and his army. Woody Holton's book on Black Americans in the Revolutionary Era is self-explanatory. African Americans have different roles in the revolution, fighting on different sides. Jane Kamensky, a very good writer, has a book about John Singleton Copley, a Boston-born portrait artist. Again, if things reopen, we'll go to the MFA and see the Copley paintings. Gary Nash, who is another of the great historians of the century, I should say. Balin's take is his great book was The Ideological Origins of the Revolution, writing about the ideas of the people who brought on the revolution and their importance. Gary Nash is a Marxist historian looking at things from the bottom up, really the progenitor of Ray Raphael has a good book, The People's History of the Revolution. Nash is a better historian. If you see Ray Raphael, don't say I said that, although he might agree. The Forgotten Fifth is another book about African Americans in the time of the Revolution. Actually, the Black population of North America was higher in 1770 than it is today. And so that's another of these very important things to remember. And then Thomas Paine's Common Sense is the book that really sparks independence in 1776. So, so start reading, and I've outlined when you should be reading what on the syllabus, so you're free to read more. And then you'll be doing, I guess, 3 papers. Well, 4, something we can talk about. Primary source assignment, finding a primary source from the period. I'll give you more instructions on where to look for things. Find say a diary of someone or a newspaper from the period and just read through a month of it. And so what's going on in this person's life, or what's this newspaper writing about, and just read through it. I don't know what you're finding. This is really an exploration of something. And I'll give you more insight into that next time. Another is an historical website. You know, a lot of historical societies have websites, and so just evaluate it. Well, what's on it? Who pays for it if it's not a site? What could you do to improve it? You should be thinking about that with everything except the primary source. And then a historical site. Again, hopefully things will reopen. You can go visit an historical site and do an evaluation of it. And I have created on Blackboard a discussion board where every week I'll be posting questions, and you should be responding to the questions, and I'll give you a place where you can raise your own questions. Now, another thing is I'm working on a podcast with Revolution 250, which is a consortium of 60 plus organizations in Massachusetts, which are working in various ways to commemorate the revolution. You know, they have the 250th anniversary of things happening. So this year, 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre. For some reason, people respond to round numbers. I mean, I'm interested in this. I was interested when it was the 247th anniversary, but 250. And so what we are hoping to do is get people excited about this so that I'm not going to be around for the 300th anniversary. I hope you will be. And then you will be able to inspire more people with this story, or get them interested in studying the story. The story is not always inspiring. Sometimes it's a tale of tragedy. Most history is. But that's really what we are doing with Rev 250. In the podcast, every week we'll be talking to an historian, someone from an historical site, reenactor, just getting at what they're doing. And I've never done a podcast before. Have any of you? No one wants to raise their hand for fear I'll be calling upon them for expert. Lizette, you have?
I did a podcast for my friend, and I did one in my science class last semester.
Okay. Then you're our authority.
Not really.
Good. Next week, we're doing our first one, and we'll see how it goes. But you should be thinking over the course of the semester, this would be an interesting thing to talk about for half an hour, or maybe a couple of you can do something together. You can work together on this. You can work as teams on this. And have anyone here listened to a podcast? See, more people have done that. I only have when I'm on, so it's kind of, I'm the wrong person to be doing this. But anyway, if you have ideas now, send them to me, or say, you know, this would be interesting. Because again, some of you I know have a lot of background knowledge on this. Some of you probably maybe have taken courses on the revolution, read a book about the revolution. I don't know. You might have just wandered in because this fit your time schedule and you needed 4 credits, and you heard that I'm an easy grader, or any of a number of other things you might know. Some of you, I know a couple of you do work at historical sites and might know more about things than I do. So we're all learning, though. I'm constantly learning new things about this period and about these events. And so as you are thinking, think about something that might be interesting, either to someone who knows a whole lot, or to someone, boy, this is the first thing I've heard, and that's really interesting. If so far all you've heard is really dull, then I guess we'll have to rethink this. But that's the other assignment, is to work on this podcast and listen to the podcast. So our first one next week, if all goes well, we'll be talking to Gordon Wood, and then you can listen to that whenever we get it up and critique it. Lizette can tell us what we did wrong, and or any of you can. You know, history is one of those things where we all can be critics, as long as we're informed critics. Are there any questions? I feel like you know, you're probably thinking, this poor guy, since classes ended in the spring, he hasn't had anyone to talk to, and now he can't stop. Are we ever going to get away? Number, you're turning off your camera, so I can't see you, but I know you're there. Well, if you have questions, you can email me. I will be doing virtual office hours. This is an interesting thing. For years, I've done office hours. No one ever comes. Now I'll do virtual office hours, see if anyone comes. But email me. I generally am responsive. And I appreciate the fact that you're doing this under not optimal circumstances, and hopefully we'll all enjoy learning things and learning more about the revolution, and we'll understand it better when we finish, okay? So thank you. I will look forward to seeing you actually a week from today.
All right, thanks, Professor. See you next week.
Take care.
See you, Professor.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
How you doing, Dylan?